The darkness of space stretched forever around the broken fleet. Hundreds of ships drifted in a loose formation, their hulls scarred and patched from countless battles. These were the last survivors of the Galactic Federation, refugees from 12 different worlds that no longer existed. Commander Hyunwoo stood on the bridge of the New Seoul, watching the stars through cracked viewports. His uniform was dirty and torn like everyone else's. They had been running for 3 months now, jumping from system to system, always one step ahead of the Valthak Empire. But the enemy was getting closer. "Sir, we have a problem," said Captain So-min as she walked onto the bridge. Her face was pale and tired. She had been working without sleep for days, trying to keep their science ship running with broken parts and hope. Hyunwoo turned to face her. "What kind of problem?" "Long-range sensors picked up something. A Valthak hunter fleet, 12 heavy cruisers and at least 40 smaller ships. They're 3 days away and moving fast." The bridge went quiet. Everyone knew what this meant. The Valthak had found them again, and this time there was nowhere left to run. "How many ships do we have that can still fight?" Hyunwoo asked. So-min checked her tablet. "Maybe 6? The rest are civilian transports or too damaged to be useful in battle." Hyunwoo nodded slowly. 6 ships against 50. It was hopeless, but he had learned not to say that word around humans. They had a strange reaction to hopeless situations. Across the fleet, other species were having different conversations. On the crystal shipwright path, Admiral Vexitar of the Nathari was preparing funeral ceremonies. His people believed in accepting fate with dignity. The crystalline beings had ruled 1,000 worlds for 10,000 years, but they knew when defeat was final. The Zephyrians, who lived as gas clouds in special containers, were even more practical. High Wind Coordinator Atmospheric Current 7 was already calculating the best way to surrender. His people had survived by knowing when to bend like wind before a storm. The insect-like Klaxons were discussing how to preserve their genetic material for future generations. The reptilian Surians were choosing which of their young would carry on their culture. Every species had accepted the same truth. They were going to die in 3 days. Every species except the humans. On the human ships, the conversations were very different. Engineering Chief Da-yoon was crawling through damaged systems, looking for parts that could be turned into weapons. Lieutenant Taeho was studying star charts, not looking for escape routes but for advantages. Dr. Minseo was analyzing enemy ship designs, searching for weaknesses. "We need to call a fleet meeting," Hyunwoo said. "All the commanders." 2 hours later, representatives from all 12 species gathered in the New Seoul's main conference room. Most of them looked like they were attending their own funeral. The Nathari Admiral's crystal body was dim with sorrow. The Zephyrian Coordinator's gas form moved slowly like wind on a still day. "We all know why we're here," Hyunwoo began. "The Velthak have found us. We can't outrun them this time." Admiral Vextar spoke first, his voice like wind chimes. "Then we must prepare for the end. My people will record our final messages for any who might find them someday." "The Zephyrian fleet agrees," said Atmospheric Current 7. "We will arrange a formal surrender. Perhaps some civilian ships can be spared." The other alien commanders nodded. It was logical. It was reasonable. It was what every intelligent species would do when facing certain death. Captain So-min looked around the table. "What about fighting back?" The aliens stared at her like she had suggested flying by flapping their arms. "Fight back?" asked Vextar. "With what?" "We have 6 damaged warships against 50 fresh enemy vessels. Their technology is superior. Their numbers are overwhelming. Mathematics does not lie. Mathematics can be wrong," said Lieutenant Taeho quietly. "Impossible," said the Klaxon representative, his insect eyes clicking in disbelief. "Mathematics is the foundation of reality." Dr. Minseo leaned forward. "Maybe that's the problem. You're all thinking like normal people." "We are normal people," said Atmospheric Current 7. "What are you suggesting?" Hyunwoo smiled, and it was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had been backed into a corner and decided to bite back. "We're suggesting that maybe being normal is what got us into this mess." Over the next hour, the humans began explaining their ideas. They talked about using civilian ships as weapons. They discussed turning their escape pods into missiles. They wanted to use their own reactors as bombs. The alien commanders listened with growing horror. "This is suicide," said Vextar. "No," said So-min. "Suicide is giving up. This is fighting." But the odds of success are nearly zero, protested the Surian commander. Nearly zero is not zero, said Taeho. Da-Yoon had been quiet during most of the meeting, but now she spoke up. You know what I've learned in 3 months of running? Every time we thought we were finished, every time the situation looked hopeless, we found a way. Not because we're smarter or stronger than you, because we don't know how to quit. But surely you understand basic probability, said Atmospheric Current 7. When something is impossible, it remains impossible regardless of attitude. Dr. Min Seo pulled up a holographic display showing genetic data from all the species present. Look at this. Every one of your species has the same evolutionary trait. When faced with overwhelming odds, your survival instinct tells you to submit or flee. It's smart. It's logical. It's kept your species alive for millions of years. She highlighted the human genetic data. But look at us. We're different. When humans get desperate, we don't get careful. We get dangerous. Hyunwoo stood up. Here's what's going to happen. The human fleet is going to fight. We're going to try something that probably won't work. We're going to risk everything on a plan that makes no sense. And maybe, just maybe, we're going to win. He looked around the table at the alien faces. You can come with us or you can evacuate to a safe distance and watch. But we're not surrendering. We're not running. We're going to show the Velthak what happens when you corner a species that's too stupid to know when they're beaten. The meeting ended in silence. The alien commanders returned to their ships to prepare for death or evacuation. The humans returned to their ships to prepare for war. In the darkness of space, 2 very different kinds of fleets drifted toward an impossible battle. One fleet knew exactly how the story would end. The other fleet was about to change the rules of how stories could end. The Velthak were coming, and they had never met anything like humans before. While the alien ships prepared for death, the human vessels came alive with activity. Engineer Da-Eun crawled through the tight spaces of the Gwangju Pioneer, pulling cables and rerouting power systems. Her hands were cut and bleeding from sharp metal edges, but she kept working. This is crazy, said her assistant, Mechanic Jun-Ho, as he welded a missile launcher onto what used to be a passenger shuttle. We're putting military weapons on a ship designed to carry families. Crazy works, Da-Eun replied, not looking up from her work. Normal got us into this mess. Across the fleet, Lieutenant Taeho was coordinating similar modifications on every human ship. The cargo vessel Daegu Defender was being fitted with torpedo tubes made from water pipes. The medical ship Busan Dawn was having its surgical lasers rewired to cut through armor instead of healing tissue. The other species watched through their sensors and could not understand what they were seeing. The humans were taking civilian ships and turning them into weapons of war. It made no sense. These vessels were not designed for combat. They would be destroyed in minutes. Captain So-min stood in the engine room of her science ship watching her crew work. Chief Engineer Kyung-min was doing something that should have been impossible. He was connecting the ship's research computers directly to the weapon systems. Will this actually work? So-min asked. Kyung-min shrugged. Probably not. But if it does work, we'll be able to target enemy weak points faster than any military computer ever built. And if it doesn't work, then we'll explode in a very educational way. So-min laughed. It was not a sane laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had decided that exploding was better than surrendering. Dr. Min Seo was making a different kind of discovery. She had been studying the behavior patterns of all the refugee species, comparing how they reacted to stress and danger. The results were fascinating and terrible. She called a meeting with the human commanders. I need to show you something, she said, pulling up data on her screen. Look at this. Brain scans from the last 3 months of battles. The screen showed neural activity patterns from different species during combat. The alien patterns all showed the same thing. When danger increased, logical thinking increased too. Fear made them more careful, more analytical, more likely to find safe solutions. Now look at the human patterns, Dr. Min Seo said. The human brain scans were completely different. When danger increased, the logical centers of their brains actually decreased in activity, but other areas lit up like stars. Areas connected to creativity, risk-taking, and what scientists called irrational problem-solving. You're saying we get stupid when we're scared? Asked Lieutenant Taeho. No, Dr. Min Seo replied. I'm saying you get creative. Every other species in the galaxy has evolved to survive by being more careful when things get dangerous. Humans have evolved to survive by being more reckless. Commander Hyunwoo studied the data.
Is that why the aliens think we're insane?
Exactly. From their perspective, everything we do when we're desperate looks like suicide. But it's not suicide. It's a completely different survival strategy, one that apparently works. While the scientists studied human brains, pilot Jae-sung was preparing to test human courage. His fighter ship was barely holding together. The engines made strange noises. The weapon systems sparked when he touched them, and the life support had been failing for a week. "You don't have to do this," Captain So-min told him over the radio. "We can find another way to scout the enemy fleet." Jae-sung checked his instruments one more time. Everything was red-lined and dangerous. Another way might take too long. They'll be here in 2 days. We need to know what we're fighting now. But your ship won't survive getting close to their fleet. Then I guess I better make the trip count. Jae-sung launched his fighter into the darkness. His mission was simple and impossible. Get close enough to the Velthak fleet to gather intelligence, then return with the information. Every tactical computer said it could not be done. The enemy sensors would detect him long before he could learn anything useful. But Jae-sung was not thinking like a tactical computer. He was thinking like a human who had run out of safe options. Instead of trying to sneak past the enemy sensors, he flew straight at them. Instead of avoiding their patrol ships, he followed them home. When the Velthak fighters came after him, he did not run. He attacked. His weapons were too weak to damage the enemy ships, but that was not the point. While the Velthak pilots focused on destroying him, Jae-sung was studying their formation patterns, their communication frequencies, and their shield harmonics. The enemy was faster than him, stronger than him, and better armed than him. But they had one weakness. They were not expecting him to do anything stupid. When his engines finally failed and his life support went critical, Jae-sung made his last decision. Instead of ejecting and hoping for rescue, he flew his dying fighter directly at the Velthak command ship. At the last second, he launched a probe that crashed into their shield generators. The probe was destroyed instantly, but in that brief moment it transmitted everything it had learned about the enemy shields back to the human fleet. Jae-sung died in the explosion, but his death gave the humans exactly what they needed, a weakness in the Velthak defenses that no one else had ever discovered. Back on the New Sol, the communications team received Jae-sung's final transmission. The data was incomplete and difficult to understand, but engineer Da-eun knew what it meant. "He found a hole in their shields," she said, her voice quiet with respect for the dead pilot. "It's small and it only lasts for a few seconds when they change frequencies, but it's there." Commander Hyunwoo studied the data. "Can we use this?" "Maybe, if we time everything perfectly. If we get incredibly lucky. If we do about 6 impossible things in exactly the right order." Lieutenant Taeho smiled. "So you're saying we have a chance?" Da-eun nodded. "A very small one." "Small chances are still chances," said Captain So-min. The human fleet began preparing for something that had never been attempted in galactic history. They were going to use their weakness as a strength, their desperation as a weapon, and their complete lack of sense as a tactical advantage. On the alien ships, sensors detected the increased activity on the human vessels. The readings made no sense. It looked like the humans were preparing every ship for combat, even the ones that could barely fly. It looked like they were planning to fight, a fleet 10 times their size with weapons that should not work and tactics that violated every rule of space warfare. Admiral Vextar contacted the New Sol. "Commander Hyunwoo, our sensors indicate unusual activity on your ships. Are you preparing for evacuation?" "No, Admiral. We're preparing for war." "But surely you realize the mathematical impossibility of success." Hyunwoo looked out at the stars, where Jae-sung had died, bringing them hope disguised as desperation. "Admiral, let me explain something about humans. We've been doing mathematically impossible things for our entire history. We climbed out of caves and built cities. We learned to fly when we had no wings. We went to space when we had no business leaving our planet." He paused, thinking of the pilot who had just died to give them a fighting chance. "Mathematics told us all of those things were impossible too, but we did them anyway. Not because we're smarter than math, but because we're too stubborn to listen when math tells us to quit." Admiral Sung-ho called for an emergency meeting of all fleet commanders. The aliens expected another discussion about surrender terms or evacuation plans. Instead, they found themselves listening to something that sounded like madness. Tactical analyst Yu Jin stood at the front of the room, surrounded by holographic displays showing ship positions, energy readings, and mathematical calculations. Her presentation was precise, detailed, and completely insane. Based on the intelligence gathered by pilot Jae Sung, we have identified a 17-second window where the Velthak shields cycle to a new frequency, she began. During this window, their command ship is vulnerable to kinetic impact. Admiral Vextar's crystal form flickered with confusion. Kinetic impact? You mean ramming? Not exactly ramming, Eugen continued. More like controlled collision. We accelerate the cargo ship Incheon hauler to maximum velocity and aim it at their flagship during the shield window. The alien commanders looked at each other in disbelief. High Wind Coordinator Atmospheric Current 7 spoke first. You want to use a civilian cargo ship as a missile? That's just the beginning, said Eugen, changing the display. While they're dealing with the Incheon hauler, we detonate the reactor cores of 3 damaged ships in their fighter formation. The explosion will disable their close-range defenses. Elder Klaxon Hive Mind Unit 47 clicked his mandibles rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation. You plan to destroy your own ships? Ships that can't fight anyway, said Communications Officer Hyorin. But their reactor cores still work. We turn them into bombs. The presentation continued, each part more impossible than the last. The humans plan to use their medical ships as decoys, their science vessels as electronic warfare platforms, and their escape pods as guided missiles. They wanted to turn every weakness into a weapon. This is mathematically impossible, said the Syrian commander, his reptilian voice cold with logic. You have 17 ships. They have 52. Your vessels are damaged. Theirs are fresh. Your weapons are inferior. Their technology is advanced. Captain Dong-hyun of the mining vessel Incheon hauler stood up slowly. He was an older man, scarred from years of working in dangerous asteroid fields. His ship was not built for war, but he had volunteered to fly it into the enemy flagship. You know what I learned mining asteroids for 30 years? He said quietly. Sometimes the biggest rocks crack from the smallest hammer, not because the hammer is strong, but because you hit the rock in exactly the right place. He gestured to the tactical display. The Velthak have big ships, strong shields, powerful weapons, but they've never fought anyone crazy enough to use cargo ships as missiles. They don't know how to defend against enemies who turn their own weaknesses into attacks. Storm Coordinator Wind that carries wisdom of the Zephyrians calculated furiously. The probability of success is 0.003%. These odds are not acceptable. Acceptable to who? Asked Captain Somin. We're already dead if we do nothing. 0% chance of survival. This plan gives us 0.003%. That's infinitely better than 0. Dr. Minseo activated another display, showing historical data from human conflicts. Look at these battles. Humans fighting other humans throughout their history. The side with better weapons and more soldiers won maybe 70% of the time. 30% of the time, the weaker side won anyway. How is that possible? Asked Vextar. Because humans don't fight the way you expect them to, Minseo replied. When human armies get desperate, they start doing things that make no tactical sense. And sometimes, nonsense works better than sense. The alien commanders studied the human plan with growing horror and fascination. It violated every principle of space warfare. It turned defeat into attack, weakness into strength, and logic into something unrecognizable. Hyorin displayed the final part of the plan. We've also found a way to use the Velthak coordination signals against them. Their ships communicate on predictable frequencies. If we broadcast the right interference pattern at the right time, their fleet formation will collapse. You can do that? Asked Atmospheric Current 7. Probably not, Hyorin admitted. But we can try. The worst that happens is it doesn't work. The worst that happens is you all die, Vextar pointed out. We're going to die anyway, said Commander Hyunwoo. The question is whether we die fighting or die hiding. The room fell silent. The aliens looked at the human plan and saw suicide disguised as tactics. The humans looked at the same plan and saw their only chance. Finally, Elder Klaxon Hive Mind Unit 47 spoke. This strategy is morally obscene. You are asking us to participate in mass suicide. Captain Dong-hyun laughed, and it was not a bitter laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had found joy in the most hopeless situation. You think this is suicide? Let me tell you about suicide. Suicide is giving up. Suicide is accepting defeat. Suicide is letting the Velthak win without a fight. He pointed to the tactical display. This is not suicide. This is the most human thing anyone has ever attempted. We're going to take everything the enemy thinks they know about warfare and prove them wrong. Admiral Sung Ho called for a vote. All human ships in favor of attempting the impossible. Every human commander raised their hand. All alien ships? The alien commanders looked at each other. Logic told them to evacuate. Mathematics told them the humans were wrong. Millions of years of evolution told them to preserve their lives for a better opportunity. But they had been watching humans for 3 months now. They had seen impossible rescues, unlikely victories, and crazy plans that somehow worked. They had seen a species that treated mathematics like a suggestion instead of a law. Slowly, one by one, alien hands began to rise. Not all of them. About half the alien fleet chose to evacuate to a safe distance, but the other half chose to stay and learn what impossible looked like. Vextar was one of those who stayed. I do not understand your mathematics, he said to Hyunwoo. But I have learned that human mathematics work differently than normal mathematics. How so? Asked Hyunwoo. Normal mathematics say that 0 plus 0 equals 0. Human mathematics say that 0 plus 0 plus enough courage equals 1 chance in 1,000. The fleet began preparing for battle. Ships that should have been scrapped were fitted with weapons that should not work. Crews that should have surrendered began practicing maneuvers that should have been impossible. Engineer Da-yoon worked frantically to install the reactor detonation systems. Chief Kyung-min programmed the navigation computers for collision courses. Pilot trainee Bo-young learned how to fly escape pods like guided missiles. On the alien ships that stayed, something strange was happening. The Nathari began adapting human thinking patterns. The Zephyrians started making plans that violated their careful nature. The Klaxons considered tactics that their hive mind had never computed before. They were learning to think like humans. They were learning that impossible was just another word for difficult. As the enemy fleet approached, the mixed Federation force prepared for a battle that should never have been fought. Using tactics that should never have worked, with odds that should have guaranteed defeat. But they were no longer thinking about what should happen. They were thinking about what could happen if they refused to accept the rules of reality. The Velthak were coming, and they were about to discover that some species fight differently when they have nothing left to lose. The Velthak fleet arrived 6 hours early. Commander Hyunwoo stared at the sensor readings in disbelief. 52 enemy ships had just dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system, much closer than expected. Half the human modifications were not complete. 3 ships were still installing their makeshift weapons. The coordination systems were not ready. Sir, they're moving fast, reported sensor operator Yoon-soo. They'll be in weapon range in 2 hours, not the 6 hours we planned for. Engineering Chief Kyung-soo's voice crackled over the communication system from the engine room. Commander, we have a problem. The reactor modifications on the Daegu Defender, Busan Dawn and Gwangju Pioneer are unstable. If they attempt the maneuver, they'll explode before reaching the target. The plan was falling apart before it even started. Captain So-min tried to stay calm, but her voice betrayed her worry. Our trajectory calculations were based on having more time to accelerate. With the enemy arriving early, we can't build up enough velocity for the kinetic impacts. Lieutenant Tae-ho ran new calculations on his tactical computer. The numbers were worse than before. Instead of a 0.03% chance of success, they now had approximately 0 chance. The impossible had become truly impossible. Options? Asked Hyunwoo. Evacuation, said tactical analyst Yu-jin quietly. We can still get most of the civilian ships to safety. No, said Captain Dong-hyun over the radio from the Incheon hauler. We voted to fight. We fight. But fighting was becoming academic. Fighter Squadron Leader Yoon-ji launched with only 4 operational craft. The other fighters were still being repaired or lacked pilots. 4 human fighters against 200 Velthak interceptors was not a battle. It was a massacre. The first phase of the human plan failed completely. The cargo ship acceleration sequences could not be completed in time. The reactor bombs were not ready. The electronic warfare systems needed another 3 hours of preparation. Yoon-ji's fighters engaged the enemy scout formation, and the results were exactly what mathematics predicted. Her wingman, Pilot Hae-jin, was destroyed within minutes. Pilot Seung-woo's fighter was crippled and drifting. Pilot Chang-soo ejected when his weapon systems exploded. Only Yoon-ji remained, her damaged fighter dodging between enemy ships like a leaf in a hurricane. She could not win. She could not even survive much longer. But she kept fighting anyway because that was what humans did. On the new Sol, Hyunwoo watched his plan collapse in real time. Every calculation had been wrong. Every assumption had been false. Every hope had been based on having more time than they actually had. The alien commanders who had stayed to fight began having second thoughts. This was not the human miracle they had expected. This was just normal defeat happening in slow motion. Perhaps we should consider surrender, suggested Admiral Vextar, his crystal form dimming with despair. The Veilthak do not accept surrender, reminded Dr. Mincio. They never have. Then what do we do? Asked Storm Coordinator Wind That Carries Wisdom. Captain Byung-ho of the damaged Daegu Defender answered from his crippled ship. We stop following the plan. What? Asked Hyunwoo. The plan was based on having time we don't have and ships that don't work, Byung-ho continued. So we forget the plan. We make it up as we go. His ship was one of the 3 that would explode if they attempted the reactor detonation sequence. His engines were failing, his weapons were offline, and his life support was operating on backup power. By every measure, the Daegu Defender was already dead. Engineering, what's the status on our reactor? Byung-ho asked his crew. Unstable, sir. If we try to overload it for the detonation sequence, it'll blow up in about 30 seconds instead of the planned 3 minutes. 30 seconds is enough. Helm, set course for the enemy flagship. Maximum acceleration. Sir, that's suicide. We'll never reach them. Maybe not. But we'll get close enough to make them nervous. The Daegu Defender began accelerating toward the Veilthak fleet on a collision course. Its reactor was already beginning to overload, sparks flying from damaged systems throughout the ship. Medical Officer Ji-Hai watched from her hospital ship as Byung-ho's vessel streaked toward certain death. Something clicked in her mind. She had been thinking like a doctor, trying to preserve life. But sometimes the best way to save lives was to risk them. All medical staff abandon ship, she announced over the intercom. We're changing our mission. Ma'am? Asked her chief nurse. The Busan Dawn was supposed to be a decoy. Instead, we're going to be a missile. Her medical ship was not designed for combat, but it was fast and maneuverable. More importantly, it was full of medical supplies that could be turned into explosives. Surgical laser arrays could be overloaded to create powerful energy weapons. Oxygen tanks could be rigged to explode on impact. Ji-Hai began accelerating toward the enemy formation, following Byung-ho's example. 2 ships were now on suicide runs, and the Veilthak fleet was starting to take notice. Maintenance Chief Won-sik on the supply vessel Incheon Progress had been listening to the radio traffic. His ship was supposed to stay in the rear, safely out of combat, but safety was looking less important than making a difference. Attention all ships, he announced. Life support systems can be turned into weapons. Override the safety protocols and vent your atmospheric processors directly into space. It creates a cloud that interferes with enemy sensors. He began demonstrating, turning his ship's life support into an improvised smokescreen generator. Other ships started copying the technique, creating a growing cloud of interference around the human fleet. Fighter pilot Yoon-ji, still somehow alive in her damaged craft, saw what the capital ships were doing. If they could turn life support into weapons, maybe she could turn her fighter into something else entirely. She shut down her weapon systems and rerouted all power to her engines. Her fighter was too damaged to fight conventionally, but it could still move fast. She began flying attack patterns that made no sense, diving through the enemy formation without firing a shot. The Veilthak pilots followed her, trying to destroy her, but her erratic movement was confusing their targeting systems. She was not trying to win a dogfight. She was trying to disrupt their formation while the capital ships made their desperate runs. On the alien ships that had stayed to fight, something remarkable was happening. They were watching humans fail at everything they had planned to do, then immediately start doing different impossible things instead. The Nethari Captain Vexhar made a decision that violated 10,000 years of careful military doctrine. He accelerated his crystal ship directly toward a Veilthak cruiser, not because it was part of any plan, but because the humans had shown him that plans were less important than determination. Windspeaker. Gale from the northern storms of the Zephyrians began coordinating an attack that had never been attempted by his species. Instead of the careful, calculated warfare his people preferred, he was learning to fight like humans, badly, desperately, and with no concern for the odds. The battle was chaos. Ships were exploding, formations were collapsing, and nothing was happening according to any plan. The human strategy had failed completely, but somehow the humans were still fighting. They had turned their failure into a new kind of warfare. Instead of following tactics that did not work, they were inventing tactics that might work. Instead of accepting defeat, they were creating new definitions of victory. The Valthak found themselves fighting an enemy that did not behave like any opponent they had ever faced. When human ships were crippled, they became missiles. When human weapons failed, they became improvised bombs. When human pilots were outnumbered, they became chaos agents who disrupted everything around them. For the first time in their military history, the Valthak fleet began to hesitate. Their tactical computers could not predict what the humans would do next, because the humans did not know what they would do next either. The impossible was not happening the way anyone had planned. But it was still happening. Something unprecedented was happening across the fleet. The alien species who had stayed to fight were beginning to copy human desperation tactics, and the results were unlike anything seen in galactic history. Captain Vexhar of the Nathari crystal ship had abandoned millennia of careful, calculated warfare. His vessel, the Bright Path, was now accelerating directly toward a Valthak heavy cruiser. His crystal crew, who had never in their existence engaged in reckless behavior, were volunteering for a ramming attack. "This goes against everything we are," said his crystal first officer, her light flickering with uncertainty. "Then maybe everything we are has been wrong," Vexhar replied, watching the human ships continue their impossible battle. "Look at them. They turn failure into attack. They turn weakness into strength. Maybe we can learn." The Bright Path impacted the Valthak cruiser at full speed. The crystal ship shattered on impact, but its crystalline structure conducted energy in ways the enemy had never encountered. The explosion sent harmonic frequencies through the Valthak hull that overloaded their systems. Windspeaker Gale from the northern storms was having his own revelation. The Zephyrian gas being had spent his entire existence avoiding risk, moving like wind around obstacles rather than through them. But watching the humans had taught him something new. All Zephyrian ships abandoned defensive formations, he commanded through the atmospheric communication system. "We're going to try something that has never been attempted." His people began flying their ships directly into the Valthak fighter formations. As gas beings, they could survive explosive decompression that would kill other species. When their ships were destroyed, they escaped as clouds of intelligent gas and invaded the enemy vessels. Directly, the Valthak found their own ships being piloted against them by gas creatures, who had learned human-style desperation tactics. Dr. Haiwan, monitoring the battle from the damaged medical frigate Soul Hope, was documenting something that would change galactic civilization forever. Her sensors were recording the impossible. Alien species were abandoning their evolutionary programming because they had seen humans prove that impossible things were actually possible. "Commander Hyunwoo," she called over the radio, "you need to see this data. The alien neural activity patterns are changing. They're literally learning to think like humans during combat." On her screens, the brain scans of alien crew members showed the same shift that humans exhibited during desperate situations. The careful, logical thinking was being replaced by creative, risk-taking neural patterns. "It's contagious," she continued. "Human desperation is literally spreading to other species." Commander Jin Woo of the New Soul was leading what should have been the final assault with a fleet that defied description. Half-destroyed ships held together by human engineering and alien determination. Crews made up of species who had never worked together before, all united by the human concept that defeat was just another problem to solve. The Klaxon collective ship Hive Unity had been damaged early in the battle, its hive-mind communication partially severed. But instead of retreating to repair, the insect crew began operating as individuals for the first time in their species' history. They attacked with human-style unpredictability, making decisions that their collective intelligence would never have approved. Individual action is chaos, the damaged hive mind transmitted to Jin Woo. But human chaos wins battles. The Valthak fleet was experiencing something their tactical computers could not process. They had been designed to fight logical enemies who followed predictable patterns. But humans had infected the entire battle with their illogical approach to warfare. Enemy formations began breaking down, as Valthak commanders tried to counter attacks that made no sense. How do you defend against cargo ships being used as missiles? How do you predict the movement of gas beings who had abandoned millions of years of careful flight patterns? How do you fight crystals that turn themselves into harmonic weapons? Captain So Min, still alive aboard the science vessel Busan Dawn, made a crucial discovery. The Valthak had a fundamental weakness that no one had ever exploited before. They could not adapt when their technological superiority failed to guarantee victory. "They're not retreating," she reported to the fleet. "They're not adapting. They're just trying the same tactics harder." Engineer Da-un, coordinating repairs across multiple ships, confirmed the observation. Their advantage has always been overwhelming force. They've never learned to fight when force doesn't work. Ensign Nari in the communications section made the connection that changed everything. "Sir, I'm detecting confusion in their coordination signals. They're asking their command ship for new orders, but their command ship is asking them for situation reports. They don't know what to do when the enemy does impossible things." The tide was turning, but not because the humans were winning in any conventional sense. They were losing fewer ships than expected because the enemy was making mistakes. The Valthak were trying to fight a logical battle against opponents who had abandoned logic entirely. Fighter pilot Yunji, somehow still alive in her crippled craft, found herself in the middle of an enemy formation that was falling apart. Valthak pilots were breaking off attacks to regroup, but they could not regroup against an enemy that had no group tactics. She began broadcasting on all frequencies. "All ships, stop following any plans. Make it up as you go. Confuse them with chaos." The response was immediate. Human ships began attacking in completely random patterns. Alien allies started inventing new tactics in real time. The entire battle became a storm of improvisation that the Valthak could not predict or counter. Medical Officer Ji-Hai had turned her hospital ship into a guided missile, but instead of impacting an enemy vessel, she began using her ship's tractor beams to grab Valthak fighters and swing them into each other. It was not a tactic that existed in any manual, but it worked. Maintenance Chief Wonsik discovered that venting atmosphere created more than just sensor interference. The expanding gas clouds were interfering with Valthak ship-to-ship communications. He began coordinating with other ships to create communication dead zones in the enemy fleet. The aliens who had stayed to fight were learning that human warfare was not about superior technology or careful planning. It was about turning every disaster into an opportunity, every failure into a new attack, every impossible situation into a chance to do something even more impossible. Captain Dong-hyun, whose cargo ship Incheon Hauler had been designated for the suicide run, found himself still alive when his improvised weapons actually worked. His mining lasers, never designed for combat, were cutting through Valthak armor like it was space dust. "All civilian ships," he broadcast. "Your work tools are weapons. Your cargo is ammunition. Your desperation is your advantage." The battle reached a tipping point when the Valthak command ship tried to retreat. They had never encountered an enemy that became more dangerous as the situation became more hopeless. Their retreat signal was the first time in Imperial history that a Valthak fleet had withdrawn from a battle they were winning. But the human-influenced alliance did not let them retreat. Ships that should have been destroyed hours ago were still fighting. Crews that should have been dead were still finding new ways to attack. The impossible had become inevitable. As the Valthak fleet finally broke formation and fled the system, Dr. Hae-won completed her analysis of the battle. "The data would revolutionize galactic civilization. We did not just win a battle," she reported to the survivors. "We proved that desperation is not defeat. We showed 12 species that impossible is just another word for difficult. We taught the galaxy that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to refuse to accept that it cannot be solved." The humans had not just turned desperation into triumph. They had taught other species to do the same. And the Valthak Empire, for the first time in their existence, had learned what it felt like to be on the losing side of an impossible victory.